This is a presentation about the Holocaust. The word Holocaust derives from the term holocauston, meaning a thing that is wholly burnt. In Israel, where the main language is Hebrew, it's known as the Shoah, or the catastrophe. Another important definition to understand the Holocaust is the term genocide. This is a deliberate and systematic killing of members of a particular ethnic or cultural group. In this case, it was targeting the Jewish people. The final definition that we'll deal with here is anti-Semitism. This is the belief in the racial, ethnic, cultural, and religious inferiority of Jewish people, or the singling out of Jewish people for mistreatment. The origins of the Holocaust go back a long way, with the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred in the 1st century AD. The Emperor Titus, to punish the Jews for their constant rebellion against the Roman Empire, attacked and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. In this event, he sacked the city, burnt the temple, a great temple of the Jews, and carried away all of their treasures, which is illustrated in this one. The Jews still remember this as a great catastrophe, and one small section of the temple remains, which is known today as the Wailing Wall. As a consequence of this destruction, many Jewish people fled what is now Israel and moved into Europe. This map illustrates some of the places that they went to. The blue stars of David show areas receiving Jews at various times, but the big blue line shows the dispersal or the diaspora. You can see there's a large number of migrations that occur at different times with the various dates against that. This symbol here is the symbol of Israel, which is the Star of David. It's also integrally related to Jewish people. David was one of the great historic kings of Israel. This map here also helps to explain how there came to be many Jewish communities throughout Europe. In this one, it shows the movement of Jewish people from Germany and Austria and Hungary into places like Poland and Russia. During the Middle Ages, Christians often targeted Jewish people for persecution. This particularly gruesome picture here shows Jewish people who had been rounded up and burnt to death. The reason that Christians targeted Jewish people is somewhat hard to understand, but in essence, many Christians believed that the Jews had been responsible for killing Jesus Christ, and so therefore that it was intolerable for Christians to consider them to be part of their communities. This image here also shows a persecution of Jewish people who are about to be beheaded and to be given no mercy. During the Middle Ages, persecution of Jewish people by various monarchies was quite common. As you can see here, in 1290, England expelled all of its Jewish people. In 1306, 1322 and 1394, France did the same. In 1496 and 1492, the Portuguese and Spanish governments decided to forcibly convert all their Jewish population to Christianity. Many of them decided, of course, to flee. In 1298 and 1348, and the Holy Roman Empire, which is now Germany, began mass persecutions of its Jewish population, which resulted in them fleeing. In 1421, there was a massive persecution around Austria, which resulted in many Jewish people fleeing to Poland. It's really difficult for us to see how people could have seen this as reasonable, but in the Middle Ages, Jewish people were targeted for particular ridicule. And one of the big reasons for this was because of the fact that Jewish people were not prohibited in any way from engaging in trade, but more particularly from lending money at interest. This picture here shows the famous Shakespearean play and comedy, The Merchant of Venice. In this one, Shylock, a greedy, scheming Jewish merchant, a Jewish moneylender, gets his comeuppance and ends up losing his fortune and his daughter. People in the Middle Ages would have found this hilariously funny because it was a Jewish person. In this very stereotypical and racist image here, it shows Jewish moneylenders In this particular image, you can see that they're wearing a typical Jewish hat, and they've got a grotesque nose. The reason that Jewish people were so heavily engaged in money lending was simply because their faith had no problem with people lending money at interest, whilst the Christian religion at this time preached that if you were a Christian, you would lend money at no interest. Now, it's quite obvious that if Christian people had been doing this, then there would have been no business for the Jewish people anyway. However, Christian people didn't do what they were told, and so consequently the Jewish people were able to lend money at interest. This meant that they made great profits, often became very wealthy, and people became quite envious of this. This came to be seen as the very image of the Jewish moneylender, and this painting here shows a Jewish moneylender inspecting the gold that's been paid back to him. In the top symbol here, it shows the symbol of pawnbrokers, and Jewish people were often involved in this because it was integrally involved in money lending during the Middle Ages. We're jumping forward now a long way. We're going to the period of 1918-1919. As you probably are aware, when World War I came to a rapid close, many Germans were confused and looked for somebody to blame for the loss of a war which they thought they were actually winning. The people who were seen as responsible were known as the November criminals, and this was the politicians who had replaced the Kaiser in Germany. Many people believe that this has been some sort of conspiracy, and many of them blamed it on Jewish people, because within the group who had travelled to sign the peace treaty, a number of significant financiers of Jewish background were there. The story went around that this was some sort of vast Jewish conspiracy by international Jewish moneylenders. There's of course absolutely no evidence for this, but it was something that was tapping into a fairly ancient hatred that had existed amongst some people against the Jewish people of Germany. When the German economy collapsed and hyperinflation hit, people again wanted to find somebody to blame. In this very picturesque image, it's got a picture of children who are playing with big wads of money because it has no value. During this time, people again were losing their jobs, were losing their houses, and they were looking to blame anyone. Of course, wealthy Jewish families seemed to be a perfect target. A lot of really negative stereotypes and cartoons were portrayed, such as these that are shown here. It shows Jewish people with grotesque hooked noses and big fleshy lips, yellowy skin, involved in all sorts of bizarre and evil practices. In this particular one, it shows a salesperson attempting to rip off a good Christian German woman. In the top right-hand side, it shows an evil-looking Jewish man giving sweets to her children, with obvious reference to pedophilia. In the bottom right-hand side, it shows a grotesque financier sitting on a giant bag of gold. All of these are conveying the negative Jewish stereotype. One of the other reasons which caused the conflict with Jewish communities was because many of them were involved in the efforts of the Communist Party, which was competing with the Nazi Party in Germany for popularity. As a consequence, people like Adolf Hitler, when they came to power, were able to try to argue that Jewish people and communism were both trying to take over the world. And this message was quite effectively conveyed to many people in Germany. This cartoon here shows a socialist revolutionary on the left walking hand in hand with a Jewish moneylender who is holding a giant bag of gold, suggesting, of course, that the communist revolution was funded entirely by the Jews. Again, more negative Jewish stereotypes. This poster shows a documentary which gives you a very evocative image of the evil Jew. When Hitler came to power, therefore, he was drawing on a long history of dislike and discontent, and he built upon the hatred that was felt amongst some people of the Jews. He outlined some of his hatred in this book, Mein Kampf, which he wrote whilst he was in prison after attempting an overthrow. This book became this sort of unofficial Bible of Adolf Hitler and outlined many of his wild and bizarre theories, including this little extract here. The black-haired Jewish youth lies in wait for hours on end, satanically glaring at and spying on the unsuspicious girl whom he plans to seduce, adulterating her blood and removing from the bosom of her own people. The Jew uses every possible means to undermine the racial foundations of the subjugated people. This wild and crazy anti-Semitism appealed to some people who were looking for somebody to blame, looking for a scapegoat. It's important to realise that Adolf Hitler's takeover of Germany was assisted very, very significantly by a massive police force, the Gestapo and the SS, shown here in these pictures. It's because of this reason and because of the fact that Hitler completely subverted the elections in Germany that it's very hard to know how many people actually bought his anti-Jewish propaganda and how many people didn't. It's hard to know who was voting for Adolf Hitler because of economic or other reasons and how many people actually believed in his anti-Semitic ideas. Ultimately, at this time, Hitler silenced dissent. He silenced opposition, the press, he silenced revolt, and propaganda replaced all of these things. As a consequence, it's very, very difficult for us to understand what the average German really believed during this time. This here is an image showing a picture of a schoolhouse where boys are being lectured in the arts of spotting a purebred German as opposed to a Jew. During this time, there was a belief that you could somehow scientifically identify Jewish people who were genetically inferior. The Germans at this time were being fed a diet of the Aryan race, a purebred master race that somehow Germany had a mastery of. This here shows the diagram which shows the idea of like the purebred German versus the purebred Jew. And it talks about the inferiority of the Jews as opposed to the Germans themselves. Hitler during this time was always liked to have himself shown as being the friend of good German children throughout the Reich. During this time, a famous event occurred, and this was called Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. During this time, as the New York Times points out, the Nazis smashed, looted, and burned Jewish shops and temples, and Hitler preached openly against the Jewish population. He began passing laws such as the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which forbade any sort of contact of a personal nature between a Jewish person and of German background and a German person who was of Christian background or non-Jewish origins. In this particular case, these two had some sort of relationship. The man on the right is a Jew, and the woman on the left is a non-Jewish German. They were made to wear a sign around as a sign of their humiliation. Hitler also passed what were called the Reich Citizenship Laws of 1935. In this cartoon here, it shows teachers being dragged out of the school by the cultural ministry. Teachers, university professors, public servants, all Jewish people in public life were expected to withdraw after the Reich Citizenship Laws were put into place. The event Kristallnacht is shown here with the synagogue on the top left being burnt and the chaos that is left inside another on the top right. It shows Jewish people being rounded up on the bottom left and a Jewish shop that has had all of its windows broken. All in this supposedly spontaneous demonstration, but which in actual fact was instigated by the Nazis. Following this, things got a lot worse for the Jewish population of Europe in terms of those areas that were controlled by Germany. These pictures here show ghettos, the areas in which the Jewish communities were rounded up and forced to live in extreme squalor and discomfort. You can see in the left-hand picture giant piles of rubbish mounting on the street. Germans were absolutely and utterly forbidden from passing into the Jewish ghettos unless on official business. One of the most famous ghettos was found in the city of Warsaw in Poland, where whole city blocks were just bricked in and barricaded. The conditions in this ghetto were absolutely appalling, with hundreds of thousands of people in a space which previously had probably only housed hundreds. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, diseases spread rapidly, food was scarce. It was absolutely appalling conditions. This here is one of the iconic pictures of World War II, which shows Jews being rounded up somewhere during the war. It's at this time that Hitler and his Nazi henchmen had come up with an idea